It began not with a scream, but with silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, that wraps around a room like fog, thick with something unsaid, something dangerous. No gunshot, no broken window, just a little girl walking into a courtroom, dragging behind her the ghost of what almost happened. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because beside her walked a scarred German shepherd with eyes that didn't blink and a growl that would make a killer remember the one thing he never thought could catch up with him: recognition. What came next? The crack of a gavel, the unraveling of a monster, and the whisper of a child who finally found her voice, not in words, but in trust. If you think justice always walks in with a badge and a briefcase, think again. This is the story of Lily, of Shadow, and of the moment a courtroom didn't just hear the truth, it felt it. So buckle in. And if you believe in silent heroes, shattered lives rebuilt, and dogs who never forget, subscribe to Black Footprints. We don't just tell stories. We make you feel them. Now, let's begin. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that settles into your skin and stays there. Lawyers shuffled papers, journalists whispered into phones, and spectators leaned forward in their seats, eyes glued to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber. Then silence. Not a respectful silence, but the kind that came with breath held, the kind that told you something important was about to happen. And it did. The doors creaked open, and in walked a little girl no taller than the judge's bench, her steps tentative but deliberate. Lily Thompson, just 5 years old, barely reached her mother's waist. But at that moment, with all eyes on her, she might as well have been carrying the weight of the entire trial on her shoulders. In one small hand, she clutched the thick leash of a German shepherd named Shadow, whose body bore the visible proof of old battles. A long, jagged scar across his flank, silver against his dark coat, like a lightning bolt frozen in time. The courtroom didn't breathe as she passed. Her pigtails bounced with each step, but her face remained unreadable, a porcelain mask hiding everything she had endured. She never looked at the jury, never at the defendant, just straight ahead toward the witness stand. Gregory Barnes, the man accused of trying to abduct her, sat just yards away, his expression cool, almost smug. To anyone else, he might have looked harmless, clean-cut, composed, a face you'd trust with your computer, your money, maybe even your kids. But appearances lie, and deep down, he knew that Lily's silence was the strongest weapon in his defense. But what he didn't know was that Lily had learned another way to speak. She climbed into the wooden chair with some help, her small hands gripping the edge of the seat. Shadow sat at her side, motionless, every inch the composed support dog he was trained to be. But then something happened, something that would make headlines, change lives, and shatter the illusion of Gregory Barnes's innocence. Lily's hand moved, barely. It was the subtlest flick of her fingers, a gesture so small it might have been mistaken for a nervous twitch, unless you were trained to see it. And Shadow was. The moment she made the motion, he changed. His ears shot forward, his muscles tensed like coiled wire, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled from his throat. Not loud, not barking, but enough to make the hair on every arm in that courtroom rise. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't confused. He was certain. His amber eyes locked onto Barnes like lasers, unflinching, unforgiving. It wasn't just that he sensed distress. It was recognition, pure, primal, instinctive. People in the gallery murmured. A woman gasped. Barnes shifted in his seat, his once relaxed hands now clenched on the table. Judge Daniel Whitaker, a man not easily rattled after 25 years on the bench, brought his gavel down harder than necessary. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he said, voice sharper than usual. But it wasn't just a procedural pause. Behind his commanding tone was something else. A question, an unease that curled in his gut. He'd seen witnesses cry. He'd seen them lie. But never before had a therapy dog reacted like that. Not with fear, but with certainty. As the court emptied out, Shadow remained beside Lily, alert but calm again, his job not done. And though Lily hadn't said a word, everyone knew something had just happened. Something real. Something that could not be dismissed. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need a voice. Sometimes all it takes is a girl, a gesture, and a growl to begin the unraveling of a lie. In that day, a predator in a suit started to feel the walls close in. Not from evidence, not from cross-examination, but from the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a dog who remembered what most humans tried to forget. Outside the courtroom, the buzz of whispered speculation filled the marble hallway like static in the air. The door had barely clicked shut before the murmurs began, voices bouncing off the high ceilings, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. Inside, a seasoned judge had slammed his gavel on instinct, a defendant had broken his rhythm, and a dog had growled with something that went far beyond training. Judge Daniel Whitaker stood just a few steps from the bench he'd occupied for decades, arms folded tightly, lips pressed into a hard line. His mind replayed the moment like a loop on a cracked reel. The little girl, silent as stone, her fingers twitching ever so slightly, and that dog, Shadow, becoming a live wire of focused rage. Whitaker had presided over murder trials, racketeering, federal conspiracies, but he had never seen a courtroom shift like that. Not from testimony, not from evidence, from a dog. He wasn't one to lean into theatrics or gut feelings, but something in him was rattled, not by fear, but by certainty. What happened in that room wasn't emotional support. It wasn't instinct. It was memory. Just down the hall, Lily Thompson sat curled up on a bench, knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around Shadow's thick neck. Her face was hidden in his fur, her breathing uneven. Karen Thompson, her mother, hovered nearby, her voice a hushed tremor of comfort, brushing her daughter's hair back as if the simple act might make the world feel safe again. And standing near them, with the watchful stillness of a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little, was FBI Special Agent Samuel Briggs. Briggs was not a man easily shaken. His suit was wrinkled from long hours, and his eyes carried the weight of 1,000 tragedies. But even it felt it, that gut-level jolt the moment Shadow growled. He stepped toward the judge, lowering his voice, but not his intensity. "Your Honor," he said, glancing toward Lily and Shadow. That wasn't a stress response. Whitaker didn't reply. Briggs pressed on, his voice low, measured. That dog didn't just sense fear. He recognized that man. It was personal. Now the judge turned, meeting the agent's gaze. "You're telling me the dog remembers him?" "I'd bet my badge on it." There was a pause, not for doubt, but for the realization of what that meant. Up until this point, the prosecution's entire case had rested on Lily. What she saw, what she remembered, what she might eventually say. But that strategy had felt fragile from the beginning, like building a bridge out of paper. Trauma had sealed her voice away, and no therapist, no technique had been able to reach it. Now, standing just a few feet away, was the one being who not only understood her, but could carry her truth. Shadow, not as a witness, not as an exhibit, but as something far more potent, a protector with a memory and a mind of his own. Karen turned toward them then, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He's never reacted like that before. Not once. But when Lily looked at that man and gave that little sign, Shadow changed. He was ready to fight." Whitaker nodded slowly. It wasn't just an emotional dog sensing a scared girl. This was something deeper, something primal. And if Briggs was right, and Whitaker was starting to believe he was, then the case didn't rest solely on a silent child anymore. For the first time, the court began to understand. They weren't just dealing with a traumatized girl and a loyal dog. They were looking at a team, a silent survivor and her voice in four-legged form. And that changed everything, because now, Shadow was more than a support animal. He was a living memory of the crime no one could describe, but he would never forget. It was the kind of spring afternoon that makes you believe the world is still good. Sunlight spilled across the Thompson family's front yard, turning the grass into a field of gold. Lily, barefoot and giggling, twirled in her pink dress as bubbles danced around her like tiny shimmering spirits. The air smelled of blooming tulips and freshly cut grass. Her favorite stuffed bunny lay on the porch, momentarily forgotten as she lost herself in the joy only 5-year-olds know how to feel. Inside the house, Karen Thompson stood at the kitchen sink, hands damp with soap, watching her daughter through the window. A soft smile curved on her lips. She glanced at her phone, her sister calling from Denver. Just a quick chat, she thought. Just 5 minutes. That's all it took. Karen stepped into the next room, the screen door creaking shut behind her. The wind whispered through the trees, the world still wrapped in that perfect stillness. But in the span of a breath, the world changed. A black SUV rolled to a slow, deliberate stop by the curb. The engine barely made a sound, like it had done this before. The man behind the wheel opened the door with eerie calm. His face wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Gregory Barnes. He crossed the sidewalk like he belonged there, like he wasn't about to shatter a child's sense of safety forever. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said smoothly, crouching down at Lily's level. "I have something special in my car. Want to see the puppies? They're really soft. One of them needs a girl like you to take care of it." Lily blinked up at him, caught between curiosity and something her young mind couldn't name, something that made her hands freeze at her sides. From inside, Karen's voice floated through the kitchen window. "Lily, stay close to the house." The man's smile faltered. Then it happened. Karen re-entered the room, glancing instinctively toward the yard, and her blood ran cold. The SUV, the stranger, her daughter. Her scream tore through the air, raw and panicked. "Lily!" The man's hand shot out, grabbing Lily's wrist with practiced precision. His face changed, smile gone, eyes sharp with cold intent. Across the street, Helen Morris, a retired nurse with a cane and a steel spine, had been walking her terrier. She saw everything. "Hey, get away from her!" she shouted, her voice slicing through the chaos. It was enough. Gregory flinched. His grip loosened just long enough for Lily to yank her arm back and run, bare feet pounding across the lawn, straight into her mother's trembling arms. Karen scooped her up as the SUV's tires screamed against the pavement and the vehicle vanished, leaving behind the acrid stench of rubber and fear. But Gregory Barnes hadn't just fled the scene. He'd taken something with him. Since that day, Lily hadn't spoken a word, not one syllable. She stopped drawing. She stopped smiling. She refused to sleep without every light in the house on. At the sound of a van engine, her body would shrink inward, her breathing shallow, as if the past were returning in waves too big for her tiny frame to bear. The sparkle had vanished from her eyes, replaced with the dull glaze of a child who had seen something she couldn't unsee. Karen tried everything: therapy, lullabies, long nights on the floor beside her bed. But Lily's voice remained lost, locked somewhere deep inside, where fear had built a fortress. The perfect day had turned into a nightmare. And the worst part? The man who did it still walked free. Until the day Lily walked into court, with a dog named Shadow, and a silent signal that would make the world listen. Before he was known as Lily's protector, Shadow had a different name, a badge number, and a job that demanded bravery most people couldn't fathom. He had been one of the city's most trusted K-9 officers, strong, fast, obedient, with instincts that had saved lives more times than the department could count. But it was a cold winter night that changed everything. A hostage situation gone sideways. Gunfire. Screaming. In the chaos, Shadow lunged without hesitation, placing his body between a child and a man with a knife. The blade found its mark. A deep, slashing wound down his side. And though Shadow subdued the suspect, he collapsed soon after, his blood staining the snow. They said he was a hero, and then a liability. The department, strapped for funds, did what they often do when a working dog is no longer fit for duty. Shadow was retired, his name replaced with a number on a list scheduled for euthanasia. That's when Dr. Evelyn Rhodes stepped in, a trauma psychologist who had long worked with children scarred by abuse and violence. Evelyn had seen what most couldn't, the silent war that raged behind quiet eyes. She believed in the healing power of animals, not just puppies and ponies, but the old warriors, the forgotten ones. When she heard about Shadow, she drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to pull him from the brink. She didn't see a broken dog. She saw a survivor. In her small clinic tucked behind an ivy-covered building on the city's east side, she began the long process of rebuilding him, not just physically, but emotionally. The scar down his flank never faded, but his heart? That healed, slowly, quietly, until he was ready. And that's when Lily came through her doors. She was so small that first day. Her hand clutched her mother's, her eyes empty, hollowed out by fear. She hadn't spoken since the day the man in the black van tried to take her. Therapy hadn't worked. She didn't respond to puppets, playtime, or paint. Her world had shrunk to silence and shadows. Evelyn watched the girl sit on the edge of the couch, like she was afraid even the air might hurt her. Then, with calm precision, she nodded toward the back of the room. Shadow patted in. He didn't rush to her. He didn't bark or perform tricks. He simply sat close, but not too close, his gaze steady, his body still. His presence filled the room like quiet thunder. Lily glanced at him, and then, in a moment that would change everything, she reached out. Her fingers, trembling and unsure, sank into his thick fur. No words, no sound, just contact, connection. Karen, standing nearby, gasped softly. It was the first time Lily had touched anything, anyone, in weeks. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Wherever Lily went, Shadow followed. At night, he slept beside her bed, his breathing slow and steady, lulling her to sleep. During the day, she would curl up beside him in the sunlit corner of Evelyn's office, tracing the lines of his scar with her finger over and over, as if learning a secret language. And then, one afternoon, Lily began to draw again. At first, it was simple, crayon sketches of a little girl with pigtails and a large dog by her side. But as the days passed, the images became more vivid, the same two figures standing together, always facing a looming, dark shape. The shape had no face, only a shadow, but it was always there. Lily had found her voice, not through words, but through pictures, through shadow, because sometimes healing doesn't come in breakthroughs. Sometimes it walks in quietly, scar but still standing. And sometimes the bravest souls don't wear uniforms. They wear fur. Judge Daniel Whitaker wasn't one to chase hunches. Decades on the bench had taught him that justice had no room for fantasy. Only fact, logic, and cold, hard evidence. But something about Shadow's reaction to Gregory Barnes still gnawed at the back of his mind, like a splinter too deep to remove. He found himself in his chambers long after the courthouse lights had dimmed, leafing through old police case files with the quiet desperation of a man who knew, deep down, that this wasn't just another trial. Then he found it, a 7-year-old cold case, tucked inside a faded folder with a red sticker labeled unresolved, risk level high. The report detailed a failed child rescue in a rural town outside Spokane. A little boy named Aiden had gone missing walking home from school. Eyewitnesses had mentioned a man in a dark van, mid-40s, polite, calm, just like Gregory Barnes. The kicker? The child had been lured with the promise of puppies. The detail struck Whitaker like a punch to the chest. The suspect had never been caught. But buried in the report, scribbled almost as an afterthought, was one more detail. The responding canine officer was a German shepherd named Shadow, injured in the operation, retired weeks later. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as realization hit. This wasn't the first time Shadow had met Gregory Barnes. Across the city, Agent Samuel Briggs and his partner, Agent Melissa Cruz, were poring over something far less official but no less telling: Lily's drawings. Laid out across the table like puzzle pieces from shattered mind, the drawings were simple but haunting. Always the same, Lily and Shadow standing side by side, facing a dark, faceless figure. But in one sketch, something new appeared. A wooden cabin. It sat crooked on a hill, surrounded by pine trees, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. But the most striking detail wasn't above ground. It was what lay beneath. Lily had drawn a trapdoor, hidden under floorboards. A narrow set of stairs led into a shadowy void. At the bottom, a tiny figure sat alone. Briggs stared at the drawing, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "She's never been told about a place like this, right?" he asked, voice low. No, Melissa said, and Karen swears she never mentioned anything about a cabin. Not once. Briggs looked up. Then how does she know what's under the floor? They sent a forensic team to collect soil samples from Barnes' vehicle, hoping for something, anything, that could tie him to a real-world location. It was a long shot, but when the results came back, the pieces began to fall into place. The soil in Barnes' tires contained a unique combination of silt, pine pollen, and volcanic ash, not common to most of Washington, but a perfect match to a remote stretch of wilderness 3 hours north, near an old logging trail long since abandoned. Briggs felt the chill run down his spine. "Tell me you see it," he said, laying the test results beside Lily's drawing. Melissa nodded slowly. That cabin might be real. The weight of the moment hung in the air. They weren't just dealing with an attempted kidnapping. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was bigger, older, darker, a pattern, a predator, and a dog who remembered more than anyone had realized. Shadow's growl in that courtroom hadn't been a reaction. It was a warning, a signal from a memory carved not in words, but in scent, sound, fear, and instinct. And now, at last, someone was listening. The forest was silent in that uneasy way that makes the back of your neck itch. No birdsong, no wind, just the crunch of boots over damp pine needles and the low hum of radios checking in from the perimeter. Agent Samuel Briggs walked point, his breath rising in the cold mountain air, eyes scanning the dense green ahead. The further they hiked into the trees, the more it felt like they were moving back in time, into a forgotten pocket of the world, hidden and untouched. At his side trotted Shadow, his nose close to the ground, his body tense with purpose. He wasn't just leading. He was remembering. Every few yards, his ears would flick, his nostrils flaring, until finally he stopped. Briggs followed his line of sight. There it was, half swallowed by trees and overgrowth, leaning slightly to one side, as if trying to escape its own past, stood a small wooden cabin, just like Lily had drawn. A single smoke-blackened chimney jutted from the roof. The front porch sagged inward, one shutter hanging askew. From a distance, it looked abandoned. But Briggs had been chasing monsters too long to trust appearances. "Move in, slow and quiet," he ordered. Guns raised, flashlights cutting through the murky afternoon light. The team stepped onto the porch. The door creaked open with a long, reluctant groan. Inside, the air was stale, coated with dust, the smell of rusted metal, and something sour beneath it. The living room was bare. A rotted couch, a broken chair, canned food stacked in the corner. "Nothing here," someone muttered behind Briggs. But Shadow wasn't convinced. He sniffed along the floor, his nails clicking on warped planks, before stopping at a spot near the back wall. His ears shot forward. Then he barked. Once. Twice. Loud. Urgent. And then he started to dig. His paws scratched furiously at the floorboards, tail stiff, teeth bared in focused desperation. The team moved quickly, prying up the planks. The wood gave way with a cracking sound, and beneath it, hidden beneath layers of dirt and dust, was a narrow opening. A trapdoor, just like Lily had drawn. Briggs knelt and pulled it open. The stench at first, stale air, mildew, fear. A narrow wooden staircase led down into darkness. "Flashlights on me. Let's go." Each step creaked under their weight as they descended into the basement. The temperature dropped sharply. Mold clung to the walls. In the farthest corner, behind a stack of old crates, was a small figure, huddled, unmoving. "Jesus," someone whispered. It was a girl. Thin, pale. Her clothes hung off her like rags. Her hair was matted, her knees tucked to her chest, arms wrapped tight around them. She didn't move until the beam of a flashlight hit her eyes. Then, slowly, she looked up. Her lips parted. A hoarse voice cracked through the silence. "Help! Emily Ross. Missing for over 6 months." Briggs rushed forward, pulling off his jacket, wrapping it around her fragile frame as another agent called in for emergency medical. Shadow crept forward too, his body low, tail wagging gently. Emily looked at him and somehow smiled. It was over. She was alive. Back at the cabin, the evidence came quickly. Hair samples in the bedding matched Emily. DNA from skin cells on the staircase matched Gregory Barnes. Tire tracks outside the cabin aligned perfectly with the make and model of his van. There were no more doubts. Briggs stood on the porch as the medics loaded Emily into the chopper, Shadow sitting at his side like a statue carved from loyalty. The agent glanced down at the dog. "You found her," he said quietly. Shadow didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to. He had done what no human could. He remembered what others forgot. He followed the scent of a monster back to its den. And this time, the story didn't end in silence. It ended in rescue. The courtroom was packed tighter than it had been on the first day. Word of the cabin, and the child they found alive inside it, had spread like wildfire, and now everyone wanted to see the moment the truth finally surfaced. Cameras weren't allowed, but that didn't stop the gallery from being filled with journalists, legal observers, and locals who had followed the case from the beginning. The air buzzed with electricity, the kind that only comes when something big is about to break. Lily Thompson walked in quietly, her small hand gripping Shadow's leash like it was a lifeline. Her face was pale but steady. She moved with that same slow determination, the same quiet courage she had shown weeks ago. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the crowd. But she looked at Gregory Barnes, the man who once tried to steal her from her backyard, and the man who now looked smaller than he ever had. Barnes sat rigid at the defense table. His hands, which once rested confidently on the polished wood, now trembled ever so slightly. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He had read the reports. He knew they had found the girl. He just didn't know what Lily was about to do next. Judge Daniel Whitaker, now fully convinced that this case was unlike any other he'd presided over, gave a small nod. "Miss Thompson, you may proceed." Lily climbed into the witness chair. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. With the same precision and calm she'd practiced in therapy, Lily lifted her fingers, barely, and gave the signal. It was just a twitch, a flick of her hand that most would miss. But Shadow didn't. His ears shot forward. His body stiffened. And deep from his chest came a low, guttural growl. Not loud, not frenzied, but certain. The kind of sound that doesn't ask for attention. It demands it. The courtroom froze. Gregory Barnes flinched. Not subtly. Not in a way that could be explained away. It was instinctual, his body reacting before his brain could tell it not to. Judge Whitaker narrowed his eyes. It was the exact same reaction as before. The same dog. The same signal. The same man. But this time, the courtroom had context. Prosecutor Julia Kim stood slowly, her voice clear and sharp. "Your Honor, the prosecution submits new evidence, collected just days ago from a remote property linked to the defendant." She held up a photograph of the cabin, another of the trapdoor, then the chain. "A child was found," she said, her voice unwavering. "Her name is Emily Ross. Missing for 6 months. Found chained to the wall beneath the floorboards of the structure." She turned to the jury. "DNA recovered from the links of those chains matches Gregory Barnes." A gasp rippled through the room. Barnes' hands, now visibly shaking, gripped the edge of the table as if it might stop the floor from falling out beneath him. Julia pressed forward. His van's tires matched the tracks outside the cabin. The soil from the undercarriage matches the dirt from that property. And the girl, once recovered, gave a partial description, one that matches this man. Barnes' attorney leaned in, whispering frantically into his ear. "We can still fight this," he hissed. But it was too late. Gregory Barnes' shoulders slumped. A bead of sweat traced a line down his temple. He looked at Lily again, at the small girl who never said a word but somehow told the entire truth. He licked his lips, his voice barely audible. "Your Honor." Judge Whitaker raised an eyebrow. Barnes swallowed hard. "I want to change my plea." Silence. Then the sound of the judge's gavel cutting through the moment. Barnes had just confessed, and the trial, once teetering on uncertainty, had reached its boiling point. It wasn't the cross-examination that undid him. It wasn't the lawyer's strategy or the jury's gaze. It was a silent girl with a scarred dog, and a truth too heavy to hide any longer. The verdict came down like a stone dropped in still water. Gregory Barnes, once a man who blended into neighborhoods like a shadow in the afternoon sun, was found guilty on all charges. Multiple counts of kidnapping, attempted abduction, unlawful imprisonment. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Judge Daniel Whitaker delivered the sentence. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. There would be no appeals, no loopholes, no second chances. For the families of the victims, justice had finally been served. For law enforcement, it was the closing of a dark and difficult chapter. But for one little girl, sitting quietly in the front row, the victory didn't come with handcuffs or headlines. It came after the trial, in a moment the cameras didn't capture, but one no one who witnessed it would ever forget. Lily Thompson sat still, her legs swinging off the edge of the courtroom bench, her small hands still curled around the worn leash of the dog who had never left her side. Shadow stood beside her, calm and alert, his eyes scanning the room one last time, as if making sure every threat had truly vanished. The judge had dismissed the room, but no one moved. No one spoke. Then Lily turned. She slid down off the bench and lowered herself onto the polished wood floor. Slowly, gently, she reached up and cupped Shadow's scarred face in her tiny hands. His ears twitched. His body leaned slightly into her touch, just enough to show he was listening. And then, after weeks of silence, of nightmares, of withdrawn drawings and tearful therapy sessions, Lily opened her mouth. Her voice came soft, like a whisper carried on the wind, almost too faint to believe. "Good boy," she said. She paused, her eyes glistening. "Thank you." A sound escaped from her mother, Karen Thompson, that was equal parts joy and heartbreak. She pressed both hands to her mouth and wept. Not with the grief of a mother helpless to protect her child, but with the overwhelming relief of someone witnessing the return of something precious they feared was lost forever. Around the room, everyone froze. Even Judge Whitaker stopped gathering his papers. Because that moment, that small, fragile sentence, carried more weight than the entire trial. It was the sound of a little girl finding her voice again. Not because the court told her to, not because the system demanded it, but because one dog never stopped listening, never left her, never doubted her. Shadow didn't bark or whine or move with excitement. He simply wagged his tail, a slow, steady rhythm that said, "I'm here. I'm still here." He didn't need to be praised. He didn't want attention. He just stood by her, the way he always had, the way he always would. Because some heroes don't wear badges or robes. They don't testify or make headlines. They don't need to speak to be understood. Some heroes walk on four legs, scarred but steady, loyal beyond reason, and brave beyond belief. And when a child's world falls apart, they don't fix it with words. They stand guard beside the pieces until she's strong enough to start putting them back together herself.